Parece que me toca bailar, hermano.
If you're not in the community that is Resident Evil and the general fandom, I'd highly recommend it. It's a very passionate, a very complicated fandom where every single game released has had its immense supporters and its detractors. I mean, one can say that each and every fandom honestly will have its discourse, regardless of how one feels overall about anything. Resident Evil's no different. Maybe it's because I tend to get very in the weeds with it all, but never have I seen such complicated love and hate for games than what I see with Resident Evil in particular. People I see online still have Resident Evil 5 and 6 as some of their favorite games of all time, and think the remakes of the last couple years as of the recording of this video were more of a mistake than not. But if I've learned anything in my life, is that love and hate are so closely related together that it can be difficult at times to differentiate the two. Let me give you an example. Resident Evil 7 is one that is loved by many and something of a genuine comeback for the franchise, yet a lot of people hate the first-person perspective, and many hate the inconsistent tone that the game gives throughout, horror, I guess, in the beginning, and then just straight action for the rest of the game. Resident Evil 7 in particular. With all these remakes, reboots of all these action franchises, horror franchises, and Resident Evil in particular being no different, a couple people wondered what the future was going to be. Then Capcom did something that has many people divided. They remade Resident Evil 2. One of the few things Resident Evil fans agree is the game that truly defines the series, the original Resident Evil 2. Like the game that made Resident Evil as popular as it is today. Don't get me wrong, Resident Evil 1 started everything, and the remake of 1 in particular is truly one of the most stressful things I have and ever will play in my entire life. And Resident Evil 4 obviously deserved its place in history, but to remake 2 in a different style of gameplay was a bold undertaking. That game was released to universal acclaim, even to the hardcore Resident Evil fans who preferred, the more old-style, tank-controlled style of gameplay. But more so than anything else, it definitely opened up a unique conversation that has only gotten more complicated, especially with this franchise, especially in the last couple of years. It wasn't the usual arguments or disagreements with the, I would say, different generations of Resident Evil players, the ones who prefer the more modern control scheme of, say, Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, the ones that are the new school first-person kids who are new to the series, and the ones who are still keeping the old Resident Evil series alive. And of course the ones who are so old school that tank controls are what defines survival horror. I guess what I'm trying to say is in this particular point that all of them do have their valid perspectives and their valid arguments. And I've seen forums and discords and other videos and just general conversations when it comes to the series, and one thing usually always came to the forefront, or was at least discussed when talking about, say, Resident Evil 2, specifically the remake. Are they going to remake all the games, and then something right after that, just kind of pops up? The question is asked, should they? Some people would say yes, why not? More money, remake games for a newer audience and generation, nostalgia for those who love the classics, everyone wins. But others, and usually I am in the camp of this most of the time, as the recent string of remakes, as whether video games or especially movies, a lot of the times it just doesn't tend to go very well. Not to mention the classics tend to get denigrated and sometimes forgotten to why they are classics to even begin with. Specifically the reason why and the feeling one gets when they played those games. I think Resident Evil 2 is a great example of a generally thrilling, aged, but still thrilling and immensely challenging game that is the true testament to survival horror, with characters and themes that have had such an impact and influence on the franchise that they have become absolute staples within the series. Claire Redfield, for instance, being most recently in Resident Evil Revelations 2, and Leon and Ada in Resident Evil 4 and 6, respectively. It's in many ways a history that is lost, and lost for those who were there, that is really difficult to replicate, if at all, for the newer generations to actually sufficiently understand. And many mediums that deal with these remakes absolutely do not do them well. For every, Dune movie, let's say, that being the most recent example in my head, there are several films that just completely miss their marks and are just bad movies. My personal favorite is they attempted to do a remake of Ben-Hur that they actually did, a couple of years ago. Actually had a pretty big budget and completely bombed in the box office. I love the original, but I loathe the remake. While many games and studios have largely been doing these collections, these remasters of late in lieu of remakes, those are usually done to an atrocious level themselves, to a point that it gives people pause and makes them ask, should they, be doing this? Should they actually try and make a remake of this game, and how the heck are they going to do that? And while Resident Evil 2 Remake, I think for the most part, nails many aspects of the game, and most have accepted it truly as a worthy remake, although the, I think, definition of remake is a little bit muddled, because to me it's actually, I think, as I'll detail when I talk about this game, more of a reimagining of the game itself. While Resident Evil 2 actually, hits the notes for the most part, truly accepts it as a worthy remake, Capcom also unfortunately did a remake of Resident Evil 3 with the same engine and half the effort that many like, but most, I would argue, do not consider it a true successor to the original Resident Evil 3, and actually people would prefer the original Resident Evil 3. Disappointment was the word that best described when it came to that remake, and ultimately I did not want to be disappointed, and I think most people didn't want to be disappointed when it came to that game in particular. Resident Evil 2 hit most of the main beats and did them well. Resident Evil 3 Remake hit maybe half the beats and missed the point of why Resident Evil 3 is many people's, favorite Resident Evil, even to this day. I mean, being in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, effectively, an outbreak, while trying to survive on the city streets, hearing faint bullets just as the wind blows within the city, and all you hear is just emptiness, except maybe the wails of the roaming dead, and with almost seemingly no life anywhere, and it's just you and your gun. This is what happens when a remake is bad, and especially not faithful, and loses the meaning of what made the game special and different. And I will also say that it is not, completely without irony, that the same company made both of those specific remakes with grossly different levels of quality. Like Mr. X being Beast Mode, for instance, and the Nemesis just being a sad little boy in comparison. So when it was announced that a remake of Resident Evil 4 was on the horizon, it left people, especially myself and my close Resident Evil buddies, with intrigue and worry. Resident Evil 4, for a lot of people, was really their introduction to the franchise. It was the game that literally changed gaming forever, with its innovative perspective, control scheme, and gameplay for better and for worse. I'm looking at you, quick time events. But, hearing the news that it had been in development for a while, and coming off the heels of Resident Evil Village, there was immense suspense at what this game was going to be. Was it going to be faithful? Was it going to be like Resident Evil 3 Remake, and just a shallow attempt at a game, and burn more bridges with fans who are ready to light torches? I'll say this, the day it released, I didn't sleep for 30 hours. I was working between my playthroughs just to experience what I had hoped I would experience. A truly well done, masterful, and brilliant attempt at a remake, and re-experience the things that made me fall in love with Resident Evil to begin with. Now let me say this as well, it's not perfect. Let me be sufficiently clear on that. It's a game that, especially until the Separate Ways DLC was released, was a complicated but compelling playthrough for me. For certain pitfalls that I'll explain, there were, always a moment that I didn't dream that I could see the fidelity and care that I could see when I played this remake. Now, with the DLC, it is with everything that I could have hoped for, and I could have ever wanted Capcom to do, and I'll explain it in detail with how the story goes. Now, first off, the game starts out a little differently than that of the original, which I will be referring to every now and then. The game starts with some weird ritualistic sacrifice. A girl is about to be murdered with an axe by some cult. Blood spills over the side with a, insignia. While I don't really understand the context of the scene, it is a very metal moment. Leon then recaps the last several games as he previously did in the original game. The events of the remake and what he has been, largely doing. He's been forced to serve his country and become a special agent of sorts, going to intensive training that pushed him to be the best and largely one of the most effective killing machines known to man. Also, they kept the brilliant haircut, glad they did not tinker with that as much. I really appreciate the fact that they really took it in this direction and were far more stern and clear with it. I think it's really aided by terrific voice work and the intense graphical improvements since then. It really adds everything you could want the game and the experience to be. You feel more so the soul's lost to Raccoon City and feel the pain he has been holding on to and what it has done to him since. Leon is on a mission to find the president's daughter, captured by some cult called Los Iluminados in an unknown, seemingly Spanish country, a coastal Spanish country, mind you, maybe a place near Spain or South America. It's never fully and clearly explained, at least from my understanding and reading. Either way, on your way to the location of a village where your intel has led you, one of your escorts leaves to pee, only to never return. Some real Scooby-Doo stuff here, folks. You then go out to investigate in a very different way, but I'd say a far more effective opening of Resident Evil than, the remake where it's the original, it's day and not really scary. Here it's dark, the sun's about to rise soon, and you see many disturbing things aided by these graphics. You enter a house where a man is stoking fire, and Leon asks questions about the cop and the whereabouts of Ashley, where suddenly he is violently attacked with an axe before Leon basically just cool moves this man into the wall. And it also might just be the red-blooded American in me, but I always found it strange that Leon would think it's okay to enter a stranger's home from another country with a holstered gun and be all casual about it if it's normal. Like, hi, I'm not breaking and entering. Anyways, have you seen this missing police officer? Whatever. Anyways, he is proven right as he proceeds downstairs to find more information and finds the dead body of the officer amid a distress call from the other officer and driver. Leon hears something and comes to find the first enemy of the game is seemingly mutated, I believe they are called ganados, who attack with prejudice. Once defeated, you await the incoming enemies, sneak into a room, inform Hunnigan of the discoveries, and that these people have something to do with the disappearance of Ashley Graham. Now, I do appreciate the addition of stealth in this game, which, for harder difficulties, is an absolute must in this game, or at least assist you in maneuvering around enemies you otherwise wouldn't have the ammo or firepower for. Now, after briefly escaping, you continue down your path, fighting enemies and getting a small little break of the heart, thinking your doggy companion is actually dead this time. You make it to the village, and the best part of the game, that was the funniest and greatest start to a video game we've seen in a very long time. The gameplay is in full here, as we fight through hordes and waves of enemies who are just purely relentless. Even as the Chainsaw Man appears looking as violent, vicious, and horrifying really as ever, I also do want to note that in harder difficulties there is an actual challenge difference in the games, and subtle things you may not notice in easier or harder difficulties. Like for instance, in Nightmare Mode, if you were playing this section, enemies may take several more shots obviously to take down, so it would be much wiser to run and gun rather than waste your ammo. In other parts, you might be dealing with more difficult enemies replacing regular ganados. All that being said, the combat really makes up for a lot of these difficult enemies, being as smooth as you could have ever hoped for, and cool to boot. You feel every bullet as you fire as smoke leaves the tip of your barrel, and hand-to-hand combat makes a lot more sense to me personally, really putting an emphasis on your knife combat, which is far easier than before to do, which is just a delight, especially since ammo in the game may not be as abundant or might just be, like me, a lousy shooter. Then he says it. Bingo.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
The bells ring and the enemies leave, leaving you to loot and continue through to the next area. Next area, you find a farm and a windmill of sorts, where you also get a taste of some of the newer and more difficult enemies, being these larger beasts that are far more tanky than the normal enemy, and really a good addition to diversify and make difficult the enemy pool. Now, after passing through and kicking butt with, the dynamite enemy, you stumble upon a boathouse where you hear something curious and enter. You find a man tied up who is clearly both charming and sneaky. His name is Luis Serra, and he has a very different backstory than what we are used to, but more on that later. Right now, the Big Cheese is here to knock us out and inject us with the plagas. And I have to say, seeing these scenes again in a very realistic graphical setting as one can dream of is a real joy to see. Just seeing these iconic scenes redone and done well makes my heart flutter. The character models are done exceptionally well in the environments, but most importantly, the atmosphere is just magnificently done. You feel the area feeling both dead and ominous, and you can really get the sense of history and unease that has gone on here. So far in my playthrough, it has been a well done and thoroughly and just gratifying experience. That's not even just to mention that I think largely every character has been done some justice in this transition to the newer generation and update. Even Ada, but more on that later. Right now, we escape and start using the mechanics, stealth namely, to our advantage. Here we really make use of our knives and learn parrying, which can be used as a tool to really assist in combat. It is very, very difficult, but incredible if you can master the knife. Mastery of it will get you through this game with absolute ease. Now, past this part, we meet the legend himself, the merchant, who's willing to sell us that good in terms of our weapons. I also appreciate the expansion of the many little quests you can complete throughout the game for extra stuff. You can see completing these jobs or side quests, usually simple things like collecting snakes or defacing or collecting specific objects, nets you spinnels, which in the original game you use as a currency to at least a certain degree, but now it's just used as a special added bonus to get you sweet little things. Treasure maps, stock for the MP, even jewels for your loot. I also like that they kept a lot of the same systems, but, added the fact that the merchant gives discounts every now and then, for instance, as a good addition and example. Which I objectively just find funny for a lot of reasons, like, how many customers do you have, man? What's up, bro? Anyways, we continue with our mission to find Ashley, getting the whereabouts of a church she could be at. So we largely get through many of the same parts from the original game, but updated for modern audiences with a couple of things shifted around to keep you on your toes and guessing. You eventually arrive to the Big Cheese's home, the Big Cheese himself being Torres Mendez, the staggering figure who in this game is really just more daunting than ever before. Here he finds us, and before taking us out, is stopped by Ada Wong. Now in this game, mainly her character and characterizations are done, very differently than what people would have believed her character to be, which initially caused some outrage for our beloved character. Her character is, by the way, completely redeemed in my view with the Separate Ways DLC, which I will explain at the end of the video. A little tidbit, by the way, leaving the house, you hear the whinings of a dog in what has to be the biggest trick a video game company has ever done. You sneaky bastards, Capcom. Tricked us into thinking the dog we saved in the original is just dead and we have to deal with it. Anyways, we save the good boy. He runs off for a later part of the game. Eventually, we make it back to the village where we see a major difference in this game compared to the original, where the watchtower actually blows up and we meet the dog enemies for the first time, and they just look absolutely terrifying in this game. And I'll be honest, most of the enemies and character models are done just the way you would want them to be done, just creepy. But especially these dogs, my lord, they creep me the hell out. And I think they're actually faster in this game too. Anyways, you finally make it to the church, and it's locked, which leads you to figuring out the pieces needed are at the lake. You fight through gauntlets of enemies in largely the same areas from the first, but expanded upon in this game. When you reach the lake and getting fuel for the boat to travel, you are then attacked by the creature known as Del Lago. a large beast whose character model is still actually terrifying if you are able to look at it in the main menu. Ironically, the one thing they probably didn't change at all was the Del Lago boss fight. It's not a problem, just another simple boss fight, and probably difficult to, come up with something a little bit different, or maybe better yet, just trying to be faithful to the remake. After the fight, Leon coughs up blood and passes out, leading to the next chapter. Now, every time Leon passes out, largely, he is visited in his dreams by the big bad himself, who has a very strange but not a bad look to him in this iteration. I think if I had to do, some criticisms, I think certain characterizations, how do I even explain it? I actually like how Sadler was depicted in the banter he and Leon would have in the original. It's understandable why they largely, changed some things, but I do miss really what the game had. And I thought, little tidbits like that and little aspects of that in the original game, I think probably should have made it to this game. Characterizations of Sadler aside, Leon then, wakes up after passing out for really some time. We explore the lake and the general area, which I really enjoy. It's kind of like a little mini hub area, and exploring this place is fun as you can reach the same boathouse where you found Luis, and then eventually, after some unique and tricky cave puzzles that I admitted I really needed help with, you're able to get the key to go and continue to save Ashley. Gosh, just exploring this game is just so much fun. So much loot to get. It's one of the few times getting loot and supplies actually feels like it means something. Such a thrilling feeling that I get, because most of the time playing these games it just feels like it's so by the numbers, But in games like this, literally every bullet counts. Every item has a purpose largely, and it feels fulfilling, It just feels fulfilling is really my biggest point. Every area I always have to be slow because enemies can just be around the corner. You really don't know what's going to happen, at least with your first playthrough. The anticipation and the tenseness you feel is just really palpable. Now on our way back, we are stopped by the gates closing and, of course, the El Gigante. Of course, again, scarier than before. It's faster, more brutal than ever. After fighting, getting my butt handed to me, the good boy comes and gives me some solid and necessary backup. Simple, just like the original, except I think it is a little bit faster, it's more fluid of a boss fighting experience. It's also a lot easier to do attacks, but can be brutal if you're not reacting quick enough, because the El Gigante is, let's just say, a lot more reactive. Once you defeat him, we say our goodbyes to the solid good boy. We make it back to the church. It's dark and rainy, where we eventually find Ashley, who in this characterization is much more realistic and realistically scared and combative, and at the same time also actually helpful. Although I do miss the playful and combative nature she had in the original game, also just because it's a bit stereotypical of a white teenage girl in America back in the early 2000s. I always found that charming. Although the relationship is much more personal, as in this particular case, in this remake, as she clearly trusts him and the bond begins to build that you can really see the seeds of. While it's not playful, it's a nice welcome change, as she, as a character, starts off weak and scared, and truly changes later in the game, little by little, but still. All because of Leon believing in her and being forced to adapt and survive. It's much more fitting, actually, in this particular case, and I think a little bit more realistic. Once they escape the church, they have a rendezvous, as told by Hunnigan, although the rain makes that a little difficult. Leon and Ashley face the onslaught of villagers as they escape and make their way to the extraction point. I do appreciate a little small change with Ashley, as like before, she runs with you, but in the game, you can actually have her stay tight or stay far away, but, follow, as certain situations might require her to stay back, or you might have to, bum rush past some enemies, which just really helps in those tight, close quarters combat situations. It's a small little change, but it's one that's actually very helpful in this remake. Eventually, not being able to escape via helicopter and being chased by ganados like crazy, you stumble upon the dreaded house, where Luis comes and guides you in. Luis and Leon, they have their words, largely because Luis actually was an Umbrella researcher, later revealed to have actually had a hand in some way, I believe, with the Nemesis project. I really adore Luis in this game. These characters are just far more defined in their arcs, which it's really just a nice change of pace with me, at least to see them grow and go through certain, I guess, inner turmoil, even if in some cases it's just small and generic. I think the story feels more fleshed out in a real necessary way that allows you to empathize with these people and characters in a way you couldn't in the previous, interactions of the old game. You understand them, their motivations, and you can actually see them in real time, break down and go through things that you otherwise didn't in the first game. It could just be the limitations of the console, obviously with the original at the time, and the ability of storytelling back then especially, but now games like this are great examples that if you do remakes, you really should do them like this. The conversation is then interrupted by an onslaught for the ages that makes the original game's cabin fight a walk in the park. There are more monsters, and a bigger downstairs area, honestly in a tighter upstairs area in my personal view. Oh, and those big pig-headed beasts are there for good measure. It's just a brutal part and section of this game. If they had the same gameplay as the previous game, I'd downright just, quit, because honestly, it would just be impossible. But at least you're given a fighting chance, even if you do lose quite a bit of ammo, at least in the remake. Ashley smartly finds an escape route and manages to get them all out of there, where Ashley herself, she ain't feeling too hot, as Luis realizes they are both infected. He decides he wishes to do his part in order to help them survive, and leaves hoping to be able to give them the serum that will postpone the full takeover before they are able to actually take out the Plagas. After a cutscene with Ada where Luis, I guess you could say, she inquires about the amber, more on that later, again. Leon and Ashley continue trudging on as a helicopter ride is unable to get them due to the weather. Seeking some shelter and some safety until they can escape, they continue their journey for survival. Eventually, after fighting many more baddies, you come across a very quiet and very minimally reinforced area with few, if any, ganados in sight. If you're smart, you hide Ashley, as it gives you the option, which I always find kind of cool and really just convenient. Like, Ashley, hide here. Something is not right, and my instincts are telling me that something bad is about to happen. I don't know. It's just something small that makes me feel like a badass. Like the people who can just look at the sky and know it's going to rain, even though there's literally no indication of that other than their wits and just sage knowledge. Well, in order to leave this area, you have to go through a gate with its crank missing.
Great. Sorry, didn't realize that was yours.
Upon finding the crank, you meet the Chainsaw Sisters, who are glorious and really kind of depends on your difficulty setting, but a pretty darn hard boss fight to beat, as they are intense. They just fight you tooth and nail as enemies walk in on you left and right. Another onslaught of enemies. At this point, I noticed little things in my overall gameplay, at least on normal settings, that it is actually pretty well balanced for the most part. Ammo isn't a problem unless you're a terrible aim like me, and while enemies seem numerous, they aren't completely overwhelming. Point being that combat is finding that right balance, which this game largely does, but more importantly, I would say that unlike several games, Resident Evil included, there just always seems to be sections of games where they just throw enemies at you because there isn't anything else that they could do creatively at that moment to make the game fun and challenging. Here, it's different. It is purposeful. And most of this game is largely, where you feel the weight of every fight. Every fight has a point to it. Soon after, though, Menendez catches up to you, brushing you aside like you're weak spaghetti and having to escape him with Ashley in tow. Hopefully you saved enough ammo and are very quick-witted. Ashley gets stuck, but your quick thinking gets you off the bridge and to safety, at least for the moment. Later, entering the slaughterhouse, you are once again ambushed by the big man himself. who, after saying a very biblical saying and praying to the gods to give him strength, he transforms into this beastly form, which just looks fantastic in this game. Fighting him is largely the same as the original, as he has his two phases. One where he's on the ground, and the second where he is cut in half and starts swinging from the banisters, throwing things at you like a, a-hole. He's a lot simpler, but just as formidable, especially in his second phase, where he can just be just an absolute real pain to deal with. Now, once you defeat him, you continue on at what appears to be a castle, strangely enough, and coincidentally the area that Luis is going to be meeting you next. Like, literally just right next to you. I'm probably not remembering this game right, but I don't remember it being that close before. Upon entering, you meet a new variation of Leganado, a priest-like figure, some with some helmets, large scythe weapons, and even larger transformations. Spooky. I like the creep factor in this game. While it isn't as pulse-pounding or stressful as, say, the Resident Evil 2 remake was in my view, there are plenty of moments where it gets hard and critical thinking just becomes difficult really to maintain, and it's just a mountain to climb in many moments. One moment in particular is next. Artillery cannons are just murking you like crazy in this part while being chased by these bastards in just a tremendously stressful situation that requires you to, have Ashley with you by your side. You have to keep moving or you get brutalized by these big creeps or just the artillery. I'm not the biggest fan of this part. I understand it's all about survival, but it can also just be unfortunate that you turn the wrong way or don't pay attention quick enough, and the next thing you know, Ashley got hit twice and she's just dead. This could have been done just a little bit better without cheesing the game. And I just remember, at least in my original playthrough, I would just have her underneath a bridge, just leave her there for a minute or two, snipe out one of the big catapult things, and then have her come follow me once it became a little bit easier. But you really can't do that in this game, and at least in this section. I don't know, it's just me. Either way, you keep moving. Once you break open the gates, you enter just the single most atmospheric hall of all time that is just really cool to look at, honestly. Here's where you meet another big bad, Ramon Salazar, whose design honestly is just the single most off-putting design in this game. Dude, it is just an absolutely creepy looking dude in a powdered wig. Like, looking at him just makes me not want to eat anything. He just ruins my appetite. I'm exaggerating, but the point is, he's just so ugly. That's just it. He's just ugly. He's just as silly as the original and actually plays well with Leon's more serious attitude, although I do miss Leon's ridiculous livery and more, sarcastic tone, bro. Here he sends enemies and we are in the castle trying to, figure out how to progress from her. We eventually make it to a small dungeon area that is just wonderful. One of the highlights of the game for me, where you can just see the tortured souls and just an unfortunate history in this dungeon. Upon finding the key to continue, you fall through the floor in one of the most urine-soaking moments of gaming for me, just ever. This is a Garrador, which was also a highlight of the original Resident Evil 4 for me. It's just waiting and looking just magnificent as before, and you just end up fighting the creature in a room designed to get you killed. Especially in harder difficulties, see for yourself the differences in hard versus normal. He is very effective as an enemy and does a lot of damage, but you can also do this encounter without ever taking damage, which I always love as an option. Now, once killed, you are reunited with Ashley and solve several puzzles and get loot, where you then go into the dreaded water hall, which actually isn't the water hall this time. Instead, it's just the black goo hall. which I believe is a substance that's supposed to increase the speed at which the virus or the plagas infects the host. This haul is both easy and hard. Let me explain. It's easy in the sense that if you are well stocked and know what to do, but it's easy. But if you come in unprepared more than usual, you will likely suffer. This part plays out generally like the original, having to get to the other side and have actually pulled these levers while being mercilessly attacked by these enemies. Now eventually you escape and Ashley loses control of herself to Sadler and forces the two of you to be separated. Now I actually, in this game, don't mind Ashley as a companion. She's certainly not an additive by any means, but she isn't the negative that she was when the original came out. Like, I always loathed having her during those specific story missions, Waterhall especially, but at least to a small degree, I didn't notice her as often as I normally did in the remake. You continue through the castle, eventually fighting many more enemies, and ultimately enter a room where you are ambushed by Ada Wong, where it is clear the tables are at least, matched, combatively. It's good to see these two again in a game, since basically the last time we've actually seen them was Resident Evil 6. God, these two just really need to get a room. But anyways, you continue through and fight another updated version of a, I guess variant parasite is how I would probably describe it. Who looks like he would make Ridley Scott very proud of its design and also some royalties, if you know what I mean. It's both just disgustingly scary and unfortunately more annoying later on as the game continues, but I still think a very solid addition and a very solid design choice. Eventually you actually move past the castle onto the castle walls itself, where you're just bombarded again with enemies and another El Gigante who is throwing everything and the kitchen sink at you. And I gotta be honest, this part's a little bit convoluted to navigate a bit, but ultimately a manageable journey, despite the big bastard throwing things at you that can take a real big chunk of your health. Those little parasites just keep popping up, forcing you to really be on your toes in this part. Eventually, you get a cannon and just fire it on the big guy, and he goes down for, about 10 seconds before you actually put him down for good. This section is a actually pretty decent new addition to this game, I think. It's certainly not perfect, but I appreciate what they tried to add into this game, and it certainly threw me for a loop seeing another El Gigante here. Eventually, Leon meets back up with Ashley, as I see that part that I'm dreading, and the two make amends as Ashley believes she is dangerous due to her being infected and possibly might lose control again. Honestly, these moments, especially with Ashley, are very well done, where it at least seems like she's far more of a believable girl who was kidnapped and has seen things and that she's never seen before and had to grow up very quickly in a very real way. I mean, we all do at some point in life, but I think it's just a very simple and very well done addition to the game, although a little bit generic in some ways. But again, I think that's just acting and what makes this little scene where she has to be a real adult fast or she will die, engrossing. It's something I feel Leon had to do also, really truly being able to empathize with her in the Resident Evil 2 remake. It's just basically continuing this much better, more concise, and I think empathetic and realistic story that really makes Resident Evil 4 such a very good remake or reimagining so far.
Keep your dogs on a leash, Pete.
Anyways, my most hated part of either game, the dreaded maze. God, I hate this part with a burning passion. It always stresses me out, and especially this game where they added a couple wrinkles that only add to the stress. The maze, for those of you who don't know, is the name, it's obviously as the name suggests, a maze, a hedge maze filled with ferocious dogs, who especially in this game are far more difficult than in the previous game. At least in the previous game, their attack animations are more obvious. Here, it is less so, and more difficult to maneuver, especially with Ashley in tow. You have to open this door by unlocking these flags, which are scattered all across this maze. At this point in the game, barring you being Mr. Money Machine and or just ammo, conservationist, you're usually just a little underpowered and unprepared for the chaotic onslaught as dogs attack and cultist people try to attack and kidnap Ashley. Especially the part where she has to hold the lever or you hold the lever and run as she is besieged by enemies. I hate this part. It is always nerve-wracking and genuinely stressful. Now, moving on before I relive these nightmares, you escape the chaos and take a tram that brings you to a grand hall area where you have to solve the three-headed statue puzzle, which is largely the same from the first game. Each area has a piece of the statue and largely goes about it the same way in order to, get the headpiece. The wine puzzle, which is the same but with different questions and answers. The hall, where you have to go through a mini gauntlet of enemies whose heads explode, showing their plaga mutations, and you have to defeat the Crimson Priest in order to unlock and actually get the headpiece. The final one, which is always a difficult one in the previous game, was to grab the piece from the plagas in the suits of armor, which can be easy if you have enough flash grenades, but damn near difficult if you are low on ammo with weak weapons. Their designs are wonderfully done and actually genuinely scare me. Once you complete the puzzle, it appears as if it's actually a trap, which always leads me to ask, why do this puzzle if it's a trap? How do you know these pieces are actually going to lead you to an escape? Aren't you supposed to be trying to find the helicopter? I don't know. I'm just being a little nitpicky here. And at least for story sense, it doesn't make the most amount of sense. Here, though, you do get to play as Ashley in this part, which acts similarly to the original part, except it is just largely suits of plagas you have to deal with no real way to physically fight, except with this lantern, which can stun the suits, at least long enough for you to make an escape. I think this part was very well done. I always loathed the Ashley section in the OG game, but here it is done far better and done far more in an engaging way. You travel through a library after seeing the lever that will release Leon from the trap and make your way to the basement, which is just this dungeon lair part that is filled to the brim with these suits. Now once you solve the puzzle that relinquishes your real only means of defense, it's just basically hightailing it out of there, and hopefully you are a wonderful juker to avoid all these swords. This part can be a pain, and on repeated playthroughs it can become a chore, but overall, at the very least in comparison to the original, it is a far better improvement.
Can you make it down? I can catch you.
Yeah, I think so.
Ashley!
Ashley saves Leon, but unfortunately in the process is captured by what is called a Verdugo. It's one of Salazar's henchmen. You are then contacted by Ada, who gives you information on Ashley's whereabouts. Proceeding through the castle, you stumble upon just a nest of these creatures called Novistadors. These bug-like monsters who can turn invisible and make problems for you if they gang up on you. Getting past this part and crossing the bridge, closing in on Salazar's throne room, you are first confronted by a mess of cultists and 2 Garradors like in the OG, but are far more deadly. I will say this, I will know every single part of the remake that is done similarly or straight up as the original game is just harder in my view. The OG had a simpler control scheme, simpler enemies, and was far more forgivable. The remake takes the same concept but makes the enemies more diverse, more aware, more random with their attacks, not to mention just far more deadly. Like, you may have better and far more capable movement and ways to defend yourself than in the first game, but they challenge you just as hard, if not harder, in this game. This part in particular, I personally believe, is a clear example of that. It is difficult and merciless, and I genuinely appreciate the diversity and at least trying to improve the game so that's not just a cakewalk. Once you do eventually get past this part, you then confront Salazar, who is forcing Ashley to drink that black goo in order to further progress the Plagas in her system. Seeing you as an obstacle, he drops you to your death until you just, I'm going to start using it, Leon yourself to safety. In these underground sewer or water parts, you are hunted by these Novistadors until you make it to a stable landing area that leads you to the underground lab where Salazar did his experiments. Always remember to stock up, because if this was, any indication from the previous game, you know that the upcoming part is a boss fight. Now, when you see some of the tests he has done to people and just the brutality of it, did I mention how incredible this game looks? The RE engine isn't perfect, but good lord does it push the console to its limits. It's a brilliant looking game with no complaints from me. I mean, I think this game does better than most, honestly. And I mean, just the facial animations, which I think they really tried to do in Resident Evil 7, but I think largely mastered in the Resident Evil 2 remake. It's just a stunning game. But if you're smart and you actually stocked up, the further you venture, it is clear you're being hunted by none other than the Verdugo himself, who jumps in from basically just in front of you rudely as you're trying to make your way back to the elevator. Personally, just not to have to deal with this bullet sponge, I always endorse a rocket launcher. Venturing up the elevator and sadly attempting to take control, you are luckily met by Luis, who just so happens to have some medicine for you conveniently. Leon and Luis have some tension as Leon knows of his involvement with Umbrella, but Luis, which I think is explained well enough in the DLC, by the way, wishes to truly make amends for the deeds he has done. Which is great, because having a companion, although not scary or really a part of the horror genre, is a nice change of pace at this point in the game. You enter through what appears to be, some mines where they've been digging for the Plagas, among other things. I think Novistadors too, technically, I believe. At least you see the nets. Here you have to press forward with dynamite, or unless you have a rocket launcher. This part is just, wave after wave of enemies who just keep popping up out of nowhere. But once you blast the rock blockade, you enter the double Gigante boss fight.
Luis, heads up! Now we're even. Is it always like this with you?
Now, here with Luis is made much easier, thankfully, because if you were going to do this solo, it would be damn near impossible, really, without some extra flash grenades and or a lot of ammo and or, again, a lot of patience. Similar to how the boss fight was in the original, you have to drop one of the big boys in the lava pit and then slowly take down the other one. Once they are both done, you continue ahead. Eventually, you make it to the minecart section of this game, where you get to have Luis as a companion this time. Normally, I wouldn't care or like that Luis is there, to be brutally honest with you, but his character is fun, he's actually lighthearted, and actually adds some levity to the situation that is necessary to the game. The minecart largely went about it, for the most part the same way. You proceed through until you reach the end, which is just this huge hive of Novistadors. Here, it's just about getting through this part, defeating these guys who are well hidden, blend well with the environment. Also, notably, the merchant is here hiding from us. I always just wondered how the merchant always gets to these places. I know it's just a game, convenience, whatever, but still, why? Why set up shop, like, right here? Like, how many customers are you actually expecting, Why hide literally behind this entire rock facade over here that you have to crawl under in order to actually get your guns and ammo? I just want answers, damn it. Going up the elevator and out of the mines, Leon and Luis have a heart-to-heart. And he explains he doesn't want anyone to get hurt, wanting to actually make amends for his wrongdoings. Once you reach the top, however, he is immediately stabbed in the back by a knife. The knife belonging to Jack Krauser. Now this is actually a big moment, because at this point, Leon realizes Krauser is alive and is actually the reason why the president's daughter was kidnapped in the first place, assisting the cult in their world-changing plans. Leon and Krauser have a very fun, epic knife fight, by the way. Now, I've commented on games doing things creatively. I talked about Resident Evil 5, especially discussing how a fun gameplay dynamic can occur in an otherwise boring and generic boss battle when I've commented on the boss battles in Resident Evil 5. Too many times it seems, just basic and by the numbers. This is an example where I think it is the complete opposite, where it is not by the numbers. Here, you are given your basic knife controls, but ultimately are put to the test to fight Krauser, literally in one-on-one in a literal knife fight. You can shoot him, I believe, but it's so much more satisfying and aesthetically pleasing to see if you just use your knife. After some time, Luis, still alive, shoots Krauser's knife, and he ultimately leaves with Luis saying his last words.
You know, I led a pretty shitty life. But now, eh? What do you think, Leon? People can change, right?
He's given his lap key in a very poignant end to Luis, who I think was done as perfectly as he possibly could be in this game. Continuing through, you reach the clock tower section of the game and basically tell Salazar to screw off before ascending the well-armed and fortified building. I do like that they mixed the hall with the giant Salazar statue and the clock tower here actually, which I believe were just two separate events in the original game. I don't like it when games take content away from us, but if it's appropriately used and used correctly, then I generally don't have an issue with it. At this point in the game, your guns are upgraded pretty darn well, and you feel more capable as a fighter here, which, thankfully is necessary because these enemies are far easier to deal with than previously. Thank goodness. Not to say this isn't a challenge getting to the top, it's still a pain in the butt to get to the very top. Now, once you reach the top, you walk. Do not run across these rickety bridges to reach Salazar, who is taking Ashley away to Sadler. Leon, finally having enough, shoots the Castellanos, hopefully dead, but not really.
Allow me to show you the power I've been granted by my master, the power of God! The stage is set for the final act!
The Ramon Salazar boss fight is by far one of the more complicated and difficult boss fights I've ever played in a Resident Evil game personally. He is fast, moves around the room, at points where it is difficult just to even find them. His attacks can be very deadly and numerous, and he fights with a vengeance, and even one of his moves is just a one-shot kill. Although I did find that if you down him and hit him with a bunch of golden eggs, that actually kills him immediately, which I find is a bit of a funny Easter egg. He is by far one of the most difficult Resident Evil bosses, at least in comparison to the previous ones that we've fought so far. I like to think of his boss fight as the warm-up that is to be the island, because from this point on it is just flat out complicated and a little difficult. Now, once you are able to defeat him and he cries out for his Big Daddy Sadler, you continue on your quest for Ashley, who you see is on a speedboat to the island. You'll find yourself basically your own speedboat and find that you're going to have a companion for the journey. Hi, Ada. The ride with Ada and Leon is palpable. There is a lot of tension here that I do enjoy and gives some weight to their complex relationship, discussing what's true and what's not, from the reality of what Raccoon City was. It's clear she has a real big thing for Leon, and even, might turn a new leaf from cold-blooded mercenary to maybe a change of heart. She leaves Leon, unlike most women by the way, as Leon enters the island alone. Now on the island you face what you experienced with the OG game, plague-infested militiamen who come in all shapes and sizes, including one with a Gatling gun. Handgun? I don't know. It's basically just a Gatling gun on his hand. And it is just war at this point, to be honest. Guns are blazing and you're going to fight tooth and nail to progress in order to get to Ashley, even if it is through a small army. Now, the layout is generally almost the same as the OG game, which is just wonderful to see personally. It's obviously not like a one-for-one remake of it, but a real good, imagining and reimagining of the layout of the initial fortress. Eventually, after waves of enemies, you eventually do make it inside the facility, where you eventually do find Ashley locked away, needing a high-level access keycard in order to get to her. Now, this part I was always anticipating because of their popularity and just sheer horror that they exude. The regenerators. These unstoppable creatures have numerous parasites in them, created to be just these monstrous BOWs. They cannot die unless you shoot the Plaga specifically. Now, I did not intentionally see anything on the regenerators because I truly wanted to see them for the first time myself and see what they were all about, and I gotta be honest, I was not disappointed a single second.
Fuck are you? Present for you.
Now, there are many differences in your encounters with the regenerators and the regenerators from the original game. First, I should point out that the most useful way to kill them is with a rifle and thermal scope to kill the Plagas. You actually don't get the scope in the same area, which, if memory serves, is in the freezer area in the original game. You get it at a little later part, which ups the ante and scare factor because now you have to just run in the dark from these regenerative monster beasts. Second, they are formidable and no slouch in everything I was hoping for, to be quite honest with you. The look, it's just well done. They are a little fatter, faster, and their dead eyes, especially in the dark, since you face these guys mainly in the dark most of the time, are really the only thing you ever really see coming. When I mean they are fast before they lumber towards you, but now, like, a brisk jog is more than enough to make me crap my pants. Another cool little detail is that we also get to see the evolution in real time of these guys being Iron Maidens. In fact, killing one of these guys half the time, it feels just like it turns them into Iron Maidens. I'm getting all tongue-tied because of it. A version of the regenerators, these Iron Maidens, are regenerators with spikes covering their body, doing immense damage, not to mention. Just makes me want to stay away from porcupines. God, this part is probably just the actual scariest part of this game, where I don't care about loot. I am just running and hoping to make it out alive. Eventually, escaping my nightmare fuel, you go through the lab filled with the generators. You upgrade the keycard enough to reach Ashley, where she is just passed out, and Leon starts losing his own consciousness because his medicine is wearing off. Leon passes out. Now, when he comes to, Ashley is awake with the medicine in use for her, and the two plan to get themselves up to Luis's lab to rid themselves of the virus in honor of Luis, and also just to escape and live. Ada helps in this and tells you to reach the summit of the island. You venture forth through a junkyard that leads to a furnace before facing your first Iron Maiden, who scared me the first time I played, not knowing this was going to happen. Well played, Capcom.
What the fuck? Die, you stubborn son of a bitch!
Continuing forth, you reach the trash area, filled with, well, pretty much everything, including, you guessed it, an Iron Maiden. You have to unlock the door by crossing a bridge that is activated by a lever that either you or Ashley, but mainly Ashley, has to hold. In doing so, makes her vulnerable to attack while you rush back being chased by an Iron Maiden. Again, well played, Capcom. If you're fast enough, you can kill all the baddies and then drop the bridge with the Iron Maiden with it. Eventually, you make it to a construction area, where you see a platform that will take you higher in the summit. Ashley bashes some walls with some big old balls as you hold off just every single enemy they can throw at you. On a harder difficulty, this just seems straight up impossible to get through. They come in waves and varieties, and just really trying to protect yourself and Ashley seems impossible unless you use the ball itself to your advantage. Eventually you get through and have honestly just a nice moment. Ashley wishes to, be just like Leon, an agent where he becomes her hype man almost before they enter through the large storeroom. Now inside they find the amber. The amber contains the plagas parasite, and there's a rather large one just chilling there. Almost immediately they are surprised by Sadler himself, who takes control of the two, but not before Leon shoots him in the eye. He forces Ashley to shoot Leon, but she is just strong enough to avoid shooting him, killing a guard. Sadler leaves with Ashley and just leaves Leon alive for some reason. I don't get that part. Maybe because he could just be a useful pawn. Maybe it would be a little bit more realistic to have him and Ashley go back together under the control of the Plagas. I don't know. I don't get that part, I guess. It's just really hard for me to actually understand why you would leave Leon, this one person who by any means isn't a weakling, and hoping that he won't mess up your plans. I don't know. Just story logic, I guess, but I can let this one slide. Continuing through in pursuit, you stumble upon what looks like Krauser's camp, where it is clear Krauser has so many vendettas against Leon personally. Maybe it's because Leon's good looking, I don't know. Now I will say that the one character I have seen people have issues with in this game is Krauser, and mainly with the changing of his backstory and aspects of his characterization. They changed the Operation Javier backstory, and that his purpose for working with Los Illuminados, the cult to begin with, it's just changed so much that he went from an understandable antagonist to just a simple meathead who only views power as the way to survive above all else. Now, I tend to agree with the issues of characterization, but, with that, they chose as his backstory motivation, for what it's worth, is I think it's at least done right and done in a believable way. If you're going to change something like this, which is small but drastic enough, I think they did it well enough. It's not perfect, but at least it fits the story and the context of the story that they're trying to tell. Not right, it's not wrong. It's just my own personal perspective. This leads us into the Krauser boss fight, which is really just an updated version, really, of the original boss fight, which I'm more than happy with. Only real difference being the actual knife fighting actions and, fighting. You get through his gauntlet, mostly in one piece, even as he shoots at you, knifes you, sneaks attacks you, and pretty much just comes out of nowhere and just bashes you, at least until you reach the top of the tower. There he mutates and begins his final assault on you, beating you down until you're nothing. Eventually, you get this sucker, and after, he just kept belittling you, he owns up and shows, some respect for your boy. With Krauser dead and a sweet, sweet powerful knife added to your arsenal, you proceed onto what I call the battlefield, where you just fight your way through hordes of enemies with, spoiler alert, your new helicopter buddy, Mike. Just an ultimate Chad. I do want to touch on the fact that this game seems to be going by pretty quickly to me. The island, and it might just be me, but the island parts always seem to take forever to finish and dragged on so much so in those parts, but here it's not so much. Whether it's because they considered and condensed a bunch of areas or just a better overall pace to the section of this game, but regardless, it's just a much better section of the game than it was in the original. The original, it just dragged on, and I would assume it's most people's least favorite part of the OG Resident Evil 4. Here, it's far more tolerable. This fight is brutal. It is literally just army filled with machine gun bad guys, anti-aircraft guns. You have to take them all out. Hordes of infected enemies. You just want nothing but your head. Eventually getting through his gauntlet, you're about to be picked up by a big boy Mike. That is until the man is accosted by Novisadors and killed in a crash. Rest in peace, Big Mike. You then enter a morgue of sorts, just filled with dead bodies, where you encounter yet another Regenerator and or Iron Maiden. Doing this for you, Big Mike. Just kidding. You continue up the summit, killing everything in your way with a vengeance in order to save Ashley. Eventually, you do reach the summit where you do everything you can to stop the ceremony and almost seem like you failed and hope is lost. Until Ada saves the day, in which Leon, on the verge of losing it, makes it to Luis's lab and successfully gets the plaga out of both of your bodies. Feeling great, you make your way to the surface where Leon sees Ada being hung by a rope, where Leon goes to save her. After the clearest ambush of all time occurs, you save Ada, who in return saves you as you battle the final boss of the game, the mutated Alpha Sadler.
You have forsaken only body. The bright gift to become one with us.
Now this boss is no joke. A bullet sponge doesn't even explain it. He is fast, jumps around, and you're just not aided by the fact that Novistors are coming at you from every single angle. Stock up on everything because this specific battle is just a battle of wheels and just attrition. Eventually Leon has had enough of this nonsense and proceeds to be a badass and does his Leon, just being badass, Anyways, he takes on the more mutated version of Sadler, who is just almost like a god, as he would say. You fire on him until Ada gives you a rocket launcher and try to blow him to bits before one final blow, and before Sadler is defeated. Afterwards, Leon, about to pick up the amber sample, has it taken by Ada, intending to finish her job. She gives Leon keys to a jet ski before leaving to see each other off, probably an eventual sequel. The duo then head underground, where they see the Plagas-infected enemies all turning and convulsing, as just generally having seizures due to the lack of an alpha Plagas to be in control of them. Eventually, you make it to the jet ski and ride into the sunset with, no awkward line by Ashley. Ada on the helicopter makes a call to her benefactor, who is Wesker? What? Basically explaining to her that the sample will be used to create a better virus that will make him a god at, the cost of billions of lives. Maybe because of the island or Leon himself changing her, but she doesn't fulfill her job and at gunpoint tells the pilot to take them elsewhere. That's the main game, and I think before we conclude on some final thoughts, I think I have to discuss as in-depth as I can about the Separate Ways DLC, which has to be played in order to truly get this game. I think ultimately this redeems any criticism of the characterization and the issues that people had when it came to Ada in the base game. Separate Ways has the weirdest opening I've ever seen. It's just bizarre. Like, Luis is dancing in the jail cell as he appears he's going to be sacrificed, or at least there's indication of that, only to be saved by Ada, who uses her skills with a Z to beat these suckers up. She's there to rescue Luis, who, backstory-wise, made a deal to give her Amber for a safe passage off the island. It's later revealed he worked on all the Lost Plaga stuff, and when Sadler had turned all the other scientists into mindless beasts, he successfully took out the parasite. There you go, he is there as a prisoner. Two are in Salazar's castle, where in the main hall they encounter the other of the Salazar's henchmen, the other Verdugo, where it scratches and secretly infects Ada with a strain of the Plagas. After some, hallucinogenic fighting, she is to meet Luis near the village after he retrieves a sample. But first, some mechanics, okay? Ada fights and moves differently, but also similarly to Leon, but with one main and specific difference, which is her grapple gun, which allows her to not only move across areas in the map, but also do some, Scorpion-style attacks where you grapple onto the opponent and strike the enemy. It's really a welcome addition into this more action-heavy DLC. Now, getting through the castle walls is relatively easy, but not without its challenges, dealing with cannons and numerous enemies. But I do like that there is an incentive to go stealth in this part personally, although it's just, at least for me, just easier to just run and gun. After escaping the castle, and more or less throughout this DLC, Ada is in contact with Wesker, updating him on her status on what's going on with the situation. Wesker wants that Amber, and Ada is her agent on the field to retrieve it. The grapple mechanic is a little wonky and unnatural to the series, I'd say, although it has been used before, ironically also specifically with Ada. That being said, it does overall work very well getting from place to place, and especially in combat, where it can be honestly just a genuine lifesaver if used in the right situations. Now, going to the cliffside, making her way to the church, a lot of things happen. She sees Leon for the first time in a long time and decides to ultimately help the poor man by ringing the church bells after being updated that they have kidnapped the president's daughter and he's here for the rescue. It is also during this part she laments her involvement in Raccoon City. Maybe seeing Leon has started getting her thinking about her actions instead of just being as cold-blooded as she usually is. Although waiting at the church, she realizes that they've lost Luis's signal because he was captured along with Leon, and she begins making her way to the last location, which is Torres Mendez' house. Before she can get through, she fights the Garrador that is Salazar's henchman in a really twisty and pretty hard boss fight that will leave you with very little ammo. Honestly, Ada really begins losing it, but attempts to stay focused on her mission. You eventually do make it to Menendez's house, where she sees Leon being choked out by the big cheese and shoots the man to let go of Leon. Later on, once Leon and Menendez leave, Ada enters the house in order to find any evidence of where Luis is. When she does find a possible location, she is ambushed herself by Menendez, who then sicks the entire town on you, where you just have to leave due to there just being way too many enemies and Menendez just being on your butt. Eventually, you make it to the abandoned factory, where you are just basically surprised by all the enemies there, just all of the townsfolk there. Eventually, you do find a trail of Luis's footprints and begin to follow, leading you to find a radio frequency where you finally contact him. He tells her to meet him at a cabin, where she sets off, but not before a literal metric ton of enemies and chainsaw baddies come to try to kill you. Now, leaving the factory though, Ada faints due to the Plaga effect before waking up in Menendez's home with Wesker by her side, treating the infection. Let me start by saying the relationship dynamic is rather tense, as it seems as though it's kind of him just testing her to succeed or fail and die, making it just seem like a very life or death work experience for Ada and Wesker. It's also a little bit confusing too, because at least to me, Wesker just shows up randomly at points in this game, and if I stand corrected, at this point, dude's got superpowers. Why wouldn't he just do this all, for himself and save everyone the trouble, considering at the end they kind of get the Plagas by chance and luck, to be honest with you. Maybe it's a test for Ada, maybe he's not wanting to put himself out there on the scene with the creation of the BSAA, whatever you want to use as an excuse, or, but I don't know. I just feel like if your plans fall in line with the general test, I just don't think that's really good villainy. I mean, just do the thing, why are you testing Ada? I don't know. Getting way off topic here. Eventually, though, Ada fights her way through not only the village, but hurricane-style weather, where eventually she reaches the area of the cabin, where she sees the large El Gigante, and instead of having the big boy reach the cabin and hurt our main man Leon, she distracts the big man with another El Gigante boss battle. It's not an easy fight, but the mechanics and the general area, which is the farmhouse and windmill area, it's really kind of fun, to be honest with you. You have to dodge the big man, and the best way to grapple really is to go, or the best way to use the grapple is to go from building to building effectively, and then shooting the exposed Plaga on his back. Now eventually, the big man does fall, and as Leon and the crew escape, where you eventually do end up meeting up with Luis, making sure he holds up his end of the bargain and promise. It is a tough cookie, but her vulnerability does slowly break down as, throughout this campaign, she isn't as focused as she should be. Maybe it's because of Leon, or maybe realizing she may not be as indestructible as she thinks, but we slowly see her open up and change as the campaign goes on. She shows some weaknesses, some chinks in the shield. No pun intended. Well, going back to the castle to get what Luis needs, he realizes that Ada is infected, and wishes to help her find some medicine that will assist her until she has the Plaga removed, which I don't know what Wesker was doing, but regardless, whatever. The two venture through the castle walls until they stumble upon Luis's lab, which is on fire, with Luis running inside to see if he can salvage anything. Ada eventually gives chase. With nothing salvageable, the duo begins searching the castle for the requisite ingredients to make the suppressant. Finding some red ink, Ada stumbles upon Leon as he enters, triggering that cutscene from the main game. They really just need to make out bad in this game. The tension between these two is just crazy. Ada continues to search for more ingredients, which leads her to the underground castle, where she deals with the drill section this time instead of Leon. Many of the parts that are missing in the main campaign are largely done in Ada's campaign, which is a bit of a nice little switcheroo. Underground, she faces some of the Plagas Knights while trying to beat the traps and get a small bottle puzzle in order to actually progress. I also forgot to mention, Ada is the merchant's other customer, if I haven't already. Continuing through the castle, and that dang maze again, you are contacted by Wesker on your progress as Ada sees Ashley being carried away and notifies Leon. Ada meets Luis eventually after collecting the rest of the ingredients, where he gives her the suppressant and has an adverse effect on her. And the henchman, which I think is actually named Pesanta, begins approaching. She tells him to run as she attempts to regain control. Eventually she does, and once the Verdugo leaves, Ada searches for Luis, leading her to an underground water channel in the castle where no vista doors are. Also, seriously, it's a game, but why set up the shop here, merchant, underground? Like, it makes no sense to me. Okay, whatever. You continue down the channel into spooky waterways, where you enter what appears to be an arena-like just section, with Garrador just being around the corner, which, you know, if you actually know how to use it properly. Shoot the Garrador free, make noise, have him kill all the baddies in the area. Luis at this point, I believe, is with Leon, having given him the medicine. Ada then continues in pursuit, only to still be followed by the Pesanta Verdugo. What a stalker, bro. Seriously. Anyways, Ada has had enough and decides to lure the beast into a cavernous area where she drops the bridge on it. Pesanta breaks through and is effectively the U3 boss fight from the original, although much faster, but reactive to weapons more than the original. The first part of the fight is easy enough, though. The second part, not so much, and as the tail comes alive and just chucks you into another area, and you have to fight basically just tooth and nail to survive. The creature buries itself underground, but does have a weakness with exposed plagas everywhere. Eventually, after being the big bad, Ada spits out the parasite that has been infecting her and squishes the real squishy boy before continuing her path to find Luis, who's just been recently stabbed and is dying. Ada sees Luis dying and begins the pursuit of Krauser, where she fights waves of enemies in this trap tunnel and very bizarre area, but proceeds onto the boathouse area, stealing the keys just as Leon joins the fray. Leon and Ada have a long talk with the context of you having played through Ada's part of her story, as tension is just immense, and again, these two really need a hotel room together. Ada grapples away, continuing her mission. Spying on Sadler, she is confronted by Wesker in his vintage sunglasses with a change in plans, where he gives her a suitcase which is used to override the communications facility. Okay, first off, I still don't understand why Wesker is even here still. Look, sure, maybe he wants to do the whole behind the scenes thing until Resident Evil 5, but I mean, it's just confusing because he can just do this mission quite simply himself. And second, I do not know overall how I feel about his design just personally, okay? Because, I don't know, maybe because he's Resident Evil's big bad, you know, like Avengers Thanos kind of thing going on in a lot of ways. I mean, at least his design in the franchise is consistent and iconic, you know. I also feel that the design is very realistic. It's not a bad design. It's just something off about it that I just think maybe it's just the way his face is contoured. I don't know. It just looks a little bit off. It's not a bad design. I'm not disappointed in it. At least he's not black. Nothing against Lance Reddick, the actor. I actually really enjoyed him. but at least I'm not doing the whole race swapping thing. But anyways, it's just not what I was quite expecting ultimately. One that I don't hate, but one that I don't love. Eventually, Ada continues through the island and the various facilities where she sees that Leon administers the medicine for Ashley, and she ends up assisting the two of them on their journey. On their way to finish, a regenerator appears, just scaring the bejesus out of me. Thankfully, by this point, you should have the thermoscope, though. Unfortunately, your trek continues in that dark lab area where, you guessed it, there are more regenerators. Once you get past this heart-pounding area, eventually you do make it to the gondola area, which is on the island this time, by the way. This leads you to really just a quite literal, almost Verdun-like battlefield area with turrets galore. Now, this area is both very fun and thoroughly frustrating. There are a lot of enemies, and if you enjoy this style of combat, it will be very, very thrilling. But there are so many enemies and turrets you have to mind, it becomes frustrating if you end up dying. Eventually, you do make your way to another lab, where they clearly test subjects on with the Plagas virus, and entering one room, it is really just clear something is loose within the building. It's a great small setup. Eventually, you do find the actual beast itself. Dropping down into the vent, you come across the beast called, I think it's called Martesino. It's a very, I don't know why they named these creatures the way they do. It's just a little bizarre. But it is a very heavily experimented on Plaga being who looks like Swamp Thing and Godzilla did the dirty. Pretty beastly and unstoppable. All you can do is just run as it chases you throughout this facility. Here you also come across the dreaded and yet cool laser section where you dodge and do your cool moves on before you enter the actual communications room. Here you activate the device, which actually is a bomb that will detonate and destroy the island. Now, Ada throughout the campaign has grown on me, and I think most people, at least in my personal view, she shows really a lot of vulnerability. She has soft spots and is still the cool Ada, and that puts on the show of mystery and competence. Yet here in the big moments of the game, despite always being a little antagonistic, cold in a lot of ways, she largely always does the right thing. Here she uses Luisa's drive and alters the devices and itself, and also just the detonation. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied here. Anyways, on your escape, the beast returns and you pretty much have to use the laser hallway to defeat it. Using your cool moves again, the laser severely damages the creature before you grapple to escape the room as the creature turns into just bloody Swiss cheese. Hearing the cries of Ashley, Ada on her jet ski goes to assist Leon with a real change of heart. Maybe a little love has finally taken over Ada for Leon and that hair. Proceeding through waves of enemies and the big boys, which is not easy, eventually Ada makes it to the ceremony chamber where she sees Leon in the middle of being taken over before Ada goes ham on the guy and rescues Leon and Ashley. A boss fight ensues with Sadler, and who's just a very big mad now. Here Sadler is just a lethal boss. He's a bullet sponge, and many attacks that you can really just do everything. I'll put it this way, it is just difficult. He's hard to hit, it takes a lot to hit him, and he's just fast to boot. Injure him enough and his eye comes out with his basically in the middle of his mouth, which leaves him exposed. And I'll admit, for my playthrough, I used everything I had basically on the guy. But eventually he does go down until he fakes out Ada and captures her. Eventually we just basically skip to the end and final boss fight, where we largely see what Ada was doing while Leon was fighting Sadler. Ada sees a rocket launcher, and with the time ticking down, she hurries to get the weapon while avoiding enemies, shooting their own rockets and sniping from afar. Eventually, you get the rocket and reach Leon while avoiding the tentacles yourself. Along the way, Ada meets Ashley, begging you to hurry, which I would if Ashley wasn't rudely interfering with me. You grapple onto a shipping container and give Leon the big boom he needs to take out the bad guy. Ada then takes the sample and leaves into the sunset as she confirms with Wesker the sample is secure, as he gives a very long-winded speech on what he intends to do with the sample, of course, yada yada yada, killing many people, trying to survive, basically leading up to the events of Resident Evil 5. She then sees Leon and Ashley pondering getting that hotel room as she flies off into the unknown. a changed woman. The remake of Resident Evil 4 is not perfect, and I actually think, as I've alluded to before, is probably more so actually a reimagining, if anything else. A remake, in my view, is something that is and can be basically a one-for-one copy of the original source with updated graphics, visuals, the whole deal, but also keeps the spirit and tone of the original and the thing that made it brilliant to begin with. Resident Evil 4 is not a real remake in this particular view, but a truly honorable and brilliant attempt at telling a great interpretation of the original Resident Evil 4 with a more serious tone, and I would say the perfection of the combat system that had largely started it all. Resident Evil 1, at least for me, the original one and then the remake of it, is probably by far one of the single closest remakes that I've ever seen. It is specifically the tone that it was attempting to go for and everything that they were trying to do is probably by far the closest. Sure, they add some things, but largely, for the most part, from beginning to end, it is largely the same game throughout. But I will say this about the Resident Evil 4 remake. While I personally believe the definitions are a little bit different, it is a very faithful retelling and, story, I guess you could say, akin to the Resident Evil 2 remake. Very similar in that sense. While they're not like shot-for-shot remakes or hit the same beats, etc., they largely stay faithful to what ultimately made it, I think, truly great to begin with, and that shouldn't be discounted. And I may have some gripes, little here and there, about Resident Evil 4. The game has its flaws, but for the most part, I do believe everything they tried to largely do succeeded. And I think whatever differentiations in the story, I think a good story from bad is the level of purposeness of its scenes and its characters. Like every moment, in particular in this story, I think is necessary and not just filler. I think especially the Separate Ways DLC particularly epitomizes that, as it was one where Ada needed every little moment to grow and become the character she ultimately is in the end. If you play Ada from the beginning, you would never think of her taking the pilot hostage at the end and giving the sample to Wesker, as just one specific example. Truth is, she probably wouldn't have if it was, very early in the beginning of the game. She had to grow and go on that journey in order to become the person who ultimately does the right thing. Same with Leon. After being taken by the government and losing, Raccoon City, it seems like in the very beginning he's so pessimistic. Ultimately his mission and his purpose and his relationship with Ashley and Luis are constant reminders of why he does what he does, for better and for worse. By the end of the game, he seems hopeful, realistic, but hopeful and actually glad to be alive, where he sees that even people like Luis, who can work on the whole Nemesis project, can actually do a little bit good in the end, and that there are good in people. It's little things like that that truly make, I think, good stories. It's complexity and characters. Not necessarily that everything has to be gray, or that things have to be good or bad, but ultimately that, there is good, and that there is bad, and that we should strive to do the best that we can. Sorry about that, my dog's barking, and they probably just want to go for a walk. I'll just end on this note. This game hits every single point that the original hit largely, and is a worthy game, not only to be made, but have its recognition be that of Resident Evil 4, one of the greatest games of all time. I believe this game will age like fine wine, and is one of the games that, despite it being a remake or something that actually, it's something that actually gives me hope for video gaming, honestly. While I don't think it's an actual remake by just a definition perspective, it's as close I think you can be to being a remake. And above all else, it's just a flat out fun, good time. And one that I think at the very least honors the Resident Evil franchise, and Resident Evil 4 in particular. It's one that truly does give me hope that there are better things to come for video gaming, and specifically with the Resident Evil franchise. Thanks everyone, like it and subscribe. You guys all rock.
You alright?
I'm not sure that was insane.